Welcome to Chandwell, and this is part 2 in my series where I'm showing you how I'm building an industrial building using Inkscape. If you watched the last episode, you'll remember that this is where we got to. It was the initial paper mock-up of the building, and there were a few issues with it. I had the wrong height on the back wall here. I decided that I wanted the extension on the other side of the building, and also it wasn't at the correct height for road height. So in this episode I'm going to show you how I fix those issues and turn it into this. It's a mock-up which is stuck to serial packet and which I can use to do a final check that I've got all the dimensions correct and that the building is going to look brilliant once it's placed here next to the viaduct. Okay then, so here we go. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to raise it up enough to match the height of the road. Now the road is about 20 millimeters high, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the building up by 20 millimeters. So as normal, I'm going to create a rectangle. I'll colour it in this nice vile greeny brown colour, and I'll make sure that it's exactly 20 millimeters high. So I've now got a rectangle that's the right height. Using snapping, which I've covered a lot in the last episode, I'm going to snap it to the bottom right and then drag it along and snap it to the bottom left of the building. And then what I'm going to do is, because all of these things are just rectangles, I'm just going to drag them down to make them the height as well. So it's basically just drag the rectangle down and snap it to the bottom of the rectangle we've just added. And that makes sure that those rectangles are now 20 millimeters taller than they were. If you see there, I just dropped that rectangle to the back, so the coloured ones are now on top of it. What about these ones that aren't pure rectangles though? So this one's in 2 bits. So first of all, I'm going to select them both and use Path Union just to bring them together into one shape. Now what about the bottom of it? If I drag this down, the pointed roof is going to move with it because it changes the shape of the whole shape. I'm going to draw a rectangle as ever, and using snapping, it's going to snap to the bottom of the brown shape and also the bottom of the greeny brown shape. Then basically select them both, choose Path Union, and there we have one solid shape. Let's now just scroll over here and repeat the process. So choose a rectangle, draw it underneath, snapping to all the corners so it fills the space perfectly. Select them both, Path Union, and there we have one shape. And now the building is the right height to go next to the road. So now let's move this extension from the left hand side of the building to the right. This is very easy, it's just a case of dragging shapes, which is another benefit of using separate shapes for this kind of building. So there's the brown shape. I'm going to lift that up. That's the extended side, and the orange is the not extended side. Using snapping, I'm going to snap it to the bottom. Keep all the bottoms in line. You can see here there's lots of different ways it will snap, but the way I want to snap it is just here. Snap it to the bottom of the greeny brown and the top of the red, which puts it in the right place. So before we can move the brown one, we'll need to flip it. So we can just use the horizontal flip button there. So we flipped it round, so now it'll fit nicely on the right hand side of the building, and there we are. So that is the fat side in place with the extension, and the thin side, the orange one, is also in place. So now let's put the back of the extension in the right place. This is that pink rectangle. I can just drag it along here, snap it into place, and that is the back of the extension. Now one of the mistakes that I made was I've made the back of the taller bit the wrong height. It was essentially the same height as the extended bit all the way along. So I can drag that rectangle, which is the back of the rest of the building, the non-extended bit, and essentially just use snapping to bring it up to the same height. That just leaves the red rectangle, which is the bit that goes from the taller side to the smaller side. Drag it into place. We need to put a pitched roof onto it. So I've selected it. I'm going to use Path and then Object to Path. What that does is it changes it from a special rectangle. In Inkscape, a rectangle is a special kind of object which is always four-sided with right angles, just what you'd think a rectangle was. But by doing Object to Path, it turns it from a rectangle into a normal shape. And a shape in Inkscape can have any number of points, any number of lines. So by turning it into a normal shape, it enables us to use the node tool, and then we can just select this corner here and drag it up, and using snapping it puts it into exactly the right place. So there we have the side wall of the extension and the roof that goes from the bottom of the normal roof line to the bottom of the extension. And if we drag that rectangle over on top of the orange one, you can see that it's exactly the correct pitch of roof, so that when it's in place, the roof will sit on that perfectly. And that's obvious because we've used snapping and everything goes together properly. So what we'll do is we'll drop that in place and move it to the front. And that just shows that the roof line will carry on perfectly once that's in place. That's just a little way of checking. We were fairly confident that it was going to work, and if we have a look, that actually matches exactly the brown. So we can drop that into the right place now, so it's the side of the extension, and then we can drag, using snapping, the back of the rest of the building into place. So now we've got the completed building in terms of where we wanted the extension to be. Let's just tidy things up a little bit by moving this browny green rectangle into space underneath the red main part of the building. So now we'll tidy things up a little bit more by making the front of the building all the right height. So what we'll do is we will first of all take the browny greeny bit of rectangle and we'll drag it into the right space. You see it's still a little bit too wide, so we'll drag that along, make it the right width. We'll select the green and the red and we'll use union. That makes it into one shape, and then we can move that shape to the back and then move the blue bit to the back as well. So we're getting there. So what I want to do now is put some kind of indication on the drawing of where ground level is. So ground level is obviously at the bottom of the orange opening, which is going to be the arch in the front of the building. So let's choose the line tool, and obviously it snaps. So we snap it to the corner and then holding Control down, we drag it out to the right hand to the right. That makes a perfectly horizontal line. We can then use the little middle arrow to drag it out to the correct width. And you'll see there that if you move it up or down, it stays in the right place because we are just using the horizontal scroll. So that is moved out to the full width of the building. And what I want to do now, looking at it, is I think the gaps between the windows are a little bit too close. I think the lower windows are too close to the top. So I'm going to select everything by dragging around it. So I'm going to select all of the bottom part of the drawing and just press the down key on my keyboard a few times just to increase the gap between the windows. And that obviously now means we've got to readjust the height of the building again. So similar to what I did before, create a rectangle of 20 millimeters and drag everything down. Everything that is normal rectangles we can drag down the same way as we did before. And here you can see I'm struggling a little bit with the snapping. Occasionally Inkscape gets itself a bit mixed up, or the user in this case gets himself a bit mixed up. You just have to adjust things a little bit. In this case I made the guide rectangle a little bit bigger and then snapping worked properly. So I'm just snapping them back and I'm using the same technique as I did before. So here with this orange one, instead of doing a sliver of a rectangle and doing a union, I'm just using the node tool, selecting the bottom two nodes there and dragging them down. And using snapping, they snap into the right place. So you can see there I can get that to the right height. We can just repeat that now. So select the shape, select the bottom two nodes by dragging around them and then drag it down. The ones that are normal rectangles, you don't have to do it like that, because if you remember, rectangles are different shapes. So we just select it and use the little arrow instead. You can't use the node tool on rectangles without changing them to a path first. So follow that technique twice. The normal rectangle there, just use the little arrow in the bottom left hand corner and snap it into the right place. We now have a building where the windows look a bit better to my eye. We've got ground level on and it's starting to look good. So what we're going to do next is just make the front of the building the right shape. Thank you to a viewer, Jonathan Hobbs, for telling me that this blue thing that sticks up, that I didn't know what it was called last time, is actually called a pediment. So if you'll see there, I selected the pediment and the main part of the building and I used path union just to bring them together into one shape. So all that remains is to cut the windows out of the front and the archway as well. So to do that, we're going to use path difference, or we can hold down Control and press the minus key on our keyboard to do the same thing, which is what I will do here. So I'm going to select the blue and the orange and press Control minus, and then do the same with the window. Or we can select all of the windows by dragging around them, do path union, and then select it with the back and choose path difference. And all of a sudden, all of those windows have been cut out together. And I'm really grateful to viewer Paul James for teaching me that technique, because on the last video I selected each individual window one by one and did path difference, whereas he suggested I could select them all, union them into one shape, and then do a difference with that, and it saves a lot of effort for that. So thank you very much for that tip. I'm very grateful for that. So let's get this thing printed so we can stick it on our serial packet. I'm just going to move over the one that I did in the last episode. I don't like deleting anything. I'm going to leave it here, just to one side in the document. And I'm going to just put a little note here to say what it was. I like to do this just so I never actually delete anything. That way, if for any reason I need to get back to something, it's very easy. So to print the document then, what we need to do is we're going to select the building and duplicate it with Ctrl D. Move it down here a little bit. Obviously we don't want the colours, so let's fill it in white and make the lines a kind of mid-grey and make sure that they're 0.2 millimeters wide. I've said before, I like this size because it makes a good compromise between making it accurate to get the knife onto the drawing and so that it doesn't take up too much space on the drawing itself. So similar to last time, we will drag the building down next to where our paper is, and what I need to do, I'm going to split it into 2 bits. So because each individual bit is a shape in its own right, that's not too difficult. So we've got it in 2 pieces now. What I'm going to do is just rotate them by 90 degrees using the rotate tool. It's the orange 90 degree rotate button at the top there, and then drag them into place onto the canvas. If you watched last week, you'll have then seen how I did the little flaps onto which we can apply the glue. So I'm going to do that as well. What we do is we do a rectangle, any old size, doesn't matter, because we're going to use snapping to get it into the right place. And then we're going to use path, object to path. That makes us have access to the node tool because it's no longer a rectangle. And we're just going to drag the corners in a little bit to make that kind of flap. I'm going to clone it with Ctrl D, duplicate it, flip it horizontally, and then drop it down onto the bottom there as well. So we've got the 2 flaps, we've got it placed in the middle of the A4 bit of paper. All we need to do now is print it. I just use basic black and white printing quality for this, and I'll just print onto bog standard 80 GSM Tesco value printer paper. Nothing special about it because we're not doing anything that's going to be presented, so the cheaper paper works just right. Okay, here it comes. It's the right size. That's always a good start. So we'll take this and apply it to the serial packet. So simply open up a serial packet. This is a bog standard special K kind of thing. And what we're going to do is apply the glue to the card. I always apply the glue to the card rather than the paper. Because I don't want to risk the paper getting soggy or bent or stretched or bubbly. So with something like this, I basically work out the space that I need. I'm going to cut it out with scissors first. And you don't have to do this, but generally I like to use as little glue as possible. So I don't want to glue down bits that are irrelevant. So basically cut around the building with scissors, place it onto the card, and then just with a pen, I'm going to very roughly draw around where it goes on the card. Then use a glue stick. I'm using one of these Q ones that I got in bulk off eBay. I've never had any problem with these. I sometimes use different types, but this is the one that I tend to get most cheaply. Basically make sure that the whole surface is covered. Everything that I do like this, we need to make sure that it's as covered as possible so that there's no bubbles in the paper, and also that the paper is fully stuck down across the entire surface of the card. This helps when we're cutting it out with craft knives. It means there's nothing bubbling up whenever we don't want it. And it also helps when we varnish it later on if it was a proper finished building. I find that getting down to table level helps you see if there's any spots that you've missed, which is why I'm leaning down here, so that I can see by the reflection that I've got the glue covered completely. And this is the technique I use for all of my buildings, not just the mock-ups like this. We then basically very gently smooth it on, smoothing it down as you go, essentially rolling it on. This way you keep the air bubbles to an absolute minimum. Never had air bubbles with this technique, and it doesn't stretch the paper either. Once it's in place, I then just use a wallpaper seam roller just to roll it in and get it stuck down as strongly as possible. So obviously this is just a mock-up on serial packet, but this is the technique I use for all of my buildings. So the entire viaduct at Chandwell has been built using this technique. It served me well, and it's a technique that I definitely recommend. So what we do is we simply put that aside for a couple of hours, let the glue dry absolutely fully, and then with a craft knife and a steel rule, cut it out, score along the fold marks, fold it all up, glue it together, and then we've got our card mock-up. So here we are then. I've cut it out carefully, I've scored down the edges, and I've folded it round and used our little glue flaps to glue it together. And I think it looks good. Just checking there, I've got the correct angles. If you remember, I was showing you the angles of the roof. It does look as though it's going to be correct. I put a little 90-degree fillet of card in there just to hold that bit in place because of I'd scored it on the wrong side, so the bend wasn't working correctly on the extension. But there's the roof line. The roof line looks good. It's a nice little solid model actually. Place it down next to the bridge. You'll see that I've got the height about right. The road does descend from the river bridge to underneath the arch by a few millimeters, so that'll add an interesting look to the front of the building once it's finished and put in place. So I think it fits nicely, it's just right, I'm really pleased with it, so I'm going to continue the build from here. So the next episode then, we will show you what comes next, and here we are, a sneak peek. The build is coming on really nicely. You can see I've now got the interior skeleton of the building in place, and I've got the outer walls. I've got some of the glazing in place, got windows on the outer edge, and I think it's looking really good. I've got a little bit of graffiti down at the bottom, which is going to be down just above river level, and I think that it's coming on nicely. So please watch next episode, where I'll show you how I do the interior skeleton. I always build my buildings from the inside out, and then the episode after that I'll start showing you how the edges and the textures go into place. It's a really solid building, I'm really pleased with it. So please, if you want to see how I do this in Inkscape, subscribe if you haven't done already, and tune in next time. Thanks for watching.